Thank you for that warm and generous welcome. Speaking of warmth, I do want to relate that it was a fine and very sunny 28 degrees when I left Melbourne on Tuesday. So it's something of a shock to be experiencing my first taste of a UK winter and the so-called beast from the east. And on this basis, I want to thank you all for the special effort you've made in coming out, those that have stayed all day, those that have just come for the lecture tonight, to hear a public lecture on sport history in what have been some challenging weather conditions. And so I thank you for that, and I'll return to that point a little bit later. In the meantime, I also want to thank the organisers of the conference, of which this public lecture is a part, and for their invitation to come to Crewe, which I eagerly accepted. I've watched and admired the work of the group of scholars at Manchester Metropolitan University from afar for a number of years now, and I actually see a lot of similarities between MMU and VU, Victoria University, my home institute, and particularly my College of Sport and Exercise Science there, in terms of what staff and students at both institutions have been trying to achieve in the broad area of sport and leisure studies. So thank you, Sam, thank you, Nick, thank you, Margaret, thank you, Dave, thank you, camera guy, and thank you to the sponsors especially for their support of this particular lecture. Well done, and words of encouragement to those responsible for nurturing the discipline here in Crewe, because it can be a fragile thing. We sometimes take these sorts of things for granted, but there's time and effort and energy and money that needs to go into these sorts of events. Tonight I want to spend some time delivering my paper, which includes a number of images, but I also want to encourage some question time at the end, so feel free to stockpile any queries you have for discussion at the conclusion. I've had the pleasure of teaching sport history to first-year students at Victoria University for almost 25 years now. When I enter the lecture theatre for the first time each year, I like to shock my students. And what I say to them might shock you as well. Here's what I say to first-year students at their first lecture with me. Welcome, everyone. This is going to be the best subject that you will do in your degree. And it's my job to make sure that you have the best academic experience of your life in this subject. So I like to throw out the challenge and raise the bar high right from the first lecture, particularly when most of the 200 or 300 students are not doing my sport history subject by choice. In fact, in most cases, students are doing sport history subjects because they've been designated as a core unit in their degree, whether it's a sports science, sport management, or a physical education degree. I also follow up this opening lecture gambit by saying to my students that I'm there to tell them one important thing in the first lecture. What is the important thing I want them to remember? It is this, and I often pause for effect. One lecture, I say to the students, one lecture can change your life. At this point, there's usually stunned silence in the lectures theatre, or at least a look of collective amusement. How do I know that one lecture can change your life? I say to them. How do I know that? How can I make such a bold statement? Well, I say, the answer is simple. One lecture changed my life. And if that happened to me, then it can happen to you. So then I relate the story of my life-changing lecture that I experienced at Monash University way back in 1979. Mike, you'll relate to this. Before PowerPoint, before YouTube were invented, before laptop computers were even thought of, before even overhead projectors were in widespread use. This was a time when university lecture theatres were equipped with giant chalkboards that would revolve. And at best, there was a pull-down screen in case someone was going to show a reel-to-reel film in the lecture. In this particular case, in my experience at Monash University in 1979 as an undergraduate student, the lecturer came in, a professor in Australian history with notable left-wing leanings. He sat on the edge of a lectern bench, something like this, and he just talked for an hour about the history of sport in Australia. Didn't even use the chalkboard that he had. Certainly no projector screen either. This was the only lecture on sport in a year-long subject devoted to general topics in Australian history, in one of many history subjects in the general arts degree that I was completing. I could have easily missed that lecture, that one and only lecture on sport. And I would have been none the wiser, especially in a subject where lecturing duties were shared by a number of staff. So he wasn't the lecturer for all the lectures. He just did a few of them, came in for that particular one, sat on the lectern and talked about sport. But I attended that particular lecture and it changed my life, because as I listened to him speak, a light bulb was switched on for me. I decided then and there that I wanted to pursue a career in sport history, not even knowing if such a career path existed or if such a career destination even existed back in 1979. So there is a lesson that I like to impart to my students. Be wary of missing lectures. You never know what might unexpectedly come your way. So, apart from being old school and believing in the power and potential impact of lectures, I've also come to believe, and indeed sometimes come to rely upon, the power of serendipity. What do I mean by that? Well, the dictionary says that serendipity is the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. Some might say, therefore, that serendipity, that's just luck. That's just a fluke. Or that's just being in the right place at the right time. But I think it's more than that. Let me expand on that definition with an anecdote that leads me into the topic of tonight's lecture. One of the joys of being an academic, for me at least, is the freedom to be able to research about, write about, and sometimes even teach about what interests me. So when I developed an interest in the history of women's Australian rules football, arising from some very initial but limited research I did on the topic as part of my PhD that Sam referred to, it was not difficult to share some of those findings with my students through a number of sport history units that I was teaching. These subjects included separate units and electives on the history of Australian sport, the history of world sport, and a subject called football studies, a social cultural history look at football, the world's football codes that I taught with my colleague for several years in a shared arrangement. So, in the years before the widespread digitisation of newspaper archives, I used to talk anecdotally about my research on the history of women's football, sharing my incremental discoveries over the years with the students in some of those lectures. Yes, I said, it looks like the earliest reference to women playing football in Australia occurred in Perth during the Great War. And there are also some games played in the 1920s. And look, here are some images I've just uncovered from matches played just after World War II. And here is a newspaper clipping related to women being opposed by the church because they played charity fundraising games of football on a Sunday during the 1950s and 60s. All of this, I said tentatively to the students, finally led to the formation of the first ongoing women's football competition in Australia, which was formed in Victoria in 1981. A state-based women's competition did not begin until 1981. But, as I explained to the students, it's all very patchy. We don't know much about the involvement or the background of individual players. We don't know about the circumstances under which they played or the context in which games took place. So I would usually end those particular lectures with an appeal. If there's anyone in the class that knows anything about the history of women's football, or might have a relative that played, or an aunt, or if you come across any relevant newspaper clippings or scrapbooks, please let me know. Fine. So that's how I used to disseminate my research with the students. Occasionally, not always, I got replies or responses from students on this basis. I especially remember one particular day in 2005 when a slightly older student came to see me in my office after the lecture on women's football. Bearing in mind that as a first year student, it can be quite intimidating to approach a senior staff member for a casual conversation after a lecture. You can sort of understand the mindset there. But Peter took my invitation seriously and came to see me. He said that his neighbour told him she used to play football for Carlton, one of the current AFL teams. So there's 18 elite teams in Australia that most of them have a long history. He's saying that his neighbour used to play for Carlton back in the 1930s and that she might have some photographs. Would it be worthwhile for me, he wondered, talking to her or looking at her material? This was serendipity, or a part of it, at work. For Peter eventually introduced me to Myra MacKenzie, later to be identified as probably the oldest living female footballer in the country, who was happy to be interviewed, very pleased to tell her story, and had some memorabilia to share. So, think about that. He was the only person doing research on women's Australian rules football, giving a single lecture on the topic to a student at one of the few universities in Australia that actually taught sport history, who just happened to live next door to the oldest known female football player in Australia. Luck, chance, divine intervention, call it what you will, but I'm putting it down to the serendipitous power of the lecture. Now, this is not to say that every lecture I give is as powerful or mystical, or that this public lecture is going to change your life, or indeed anyone's life. I'm sure we've all heard dreary or downright dull lectures in our lives and wondered why we bothered. And after all, here you are this evening on a pretty cold night, coming out to hear a speaker from the other side of the world talk about a particular code of football you've probably never seen played and maybe have not even read about. However, whatever your background, whatever your purpose in coming here tonight, I hope what I have to say resonates with your own research and does cause you to think afresh about the topic and the methods of your own work in sport and leisure histories. Let me also say, and this might put your mind at rest, no prior understanding of Australian rules football is required or needed in order to make sense of this lecture. So just let your sigh out there, relax. Sit back and relax, in fact, and let's see what general insights I can provide as part of my journey to uncover the hidden history of female footballers. All right, first, some very general, some very quick background on women and Australian rules football. Don't need to take notes, just let it waft over you. The code involving 18 men on a field of play with no offside rule evolved rapidly after the first rules were written down in Melbourne in 1859. As the code spread to other colonies, it became known not as Melbourne rules, but as Victorian rules, and then later Australian rules, as the code consolidated itself throughout the country. Females were always attracted to watching the game, and from the very beginning, women were a noticeable proportion of the crowd. Anywhere between 30 to 50% of the crowd that attended football matches were female. As evident by a couple of images I'll show you, and certainly evident in the press reports as well. 1877, this is a game that took place at the MCG. You can see the women in the crowd. If you're not sure, there's the football just at the back of the crowd there, and there's the members stand there. You can look at the women, the girls, and do what I did and actually do a count, a number crunch of how many women are depicted in some of the images, because the press reports certainly back that up and comment specifically on the number of women and girls and attending. Not just upper class, there's a fairly well-dressed women and their daughters trudging along to the football. All classes of women like to attend and watch and participate as barrackers at the football. I like the speech balloons coming out of these women here, brandishing their umbrellas. The newspaper reports they also taking out hat pins to stick, in this case, into the umpire, or the referee as you would call him, leaving the ground, being attacked by club officials. These were passionate supporters of football. Perhaps those other women were going for the social scene. These women were going to see their team win. And when the umpire stood in their way, they weren't going to let that stop them. It was usual for women to sit around the boundary line, and at some grounds special stands were built for the women to sit. So it's a bit of a phenomenon, I think, when we look at the codes worldwide, to realise that this code in Australia had a particular appeal for females. As I say, represented by all classes, evidenced by images and press reports, special lady stands built on some grounds, and the financial backing of female members also acknowledged in the annual reports of clubs throughout their history. There were, so to speak, the women were, so to speak, deeply embedded in the culture of the game, and they still are today, where 40 to 50% of crowds, officially, at matches of elite Australian rules football, are paid up members of their clubs, and a female. Okay, so that is quite a phenomenon. Serious competitive games for women did not start in earnest. With that as background, serious women's football did not start in earnest until the Great War. The Great War, which provided an opportunity for females to become involved in novelty charity games for the war effort and for specifically support of the Anzacs. With Perth, Western Australia, hosting the first games of this type, played between work-based teams, with many women making their own uniforms. Let me show you the earliest known team photograph of female football. This is an image taken from 1917. This is more or less the same team that first started playing in 1915. This is a department store team. These were women that worked in one of Perth's department stores, and they made their own costumes. The jockey-style cap, the little cravat around the neck, the handkerchiefs there, the skirts, which I'm told, this is their playing uniform, by the way, the skirts, which I'm told the women sewed small weights into so that the dresses didn't blow up while they were playing football. All these little quirky things that you learn about these photos. The template was set relatively early: a male coach, a female team, and usually a workplace-based team playing charity games to raise money for the comforts of the Anzacs during the Great War. And the games taking place on full-sized ovals, like so. The template was soon followed in other states, especially in Melbourne. So Melbourne was where the code was born for men, but the women's code was born right across on the other side of the country in Perth, and then moved across to Melbourne. First to Adelaide, then to Broken Hill, then to Victoria. Where, especially in Melbourne, by the 1920s, where encouraged by the example in Britain, women ditched the dresses and started to wear shorts and football jumpers, or Guernseys, as we say. Where did they get their kit from? It said that they borrowed the uniforms from the men. They borrowed the uniform from the St Kilda men's team and began to play matches in the 1920s. Much stronger emphasis on training, playing like the men, although dressed like the men, as you can see, in shorts, socks, etc. Although still with an undercurrent of censure or disbelief by some of the press. Should women play football, for example, the headline there. Let's see some other images similar to that. So here are the women practicing. You can see they're wearing the kit there, the same kit that the men would have worn, except for the hats. Always good to see some action shots to make sure that's a genuine image of what's going on. So-called place kick here. Training runs, following the ball, oval-shaped ball, kicking style, etc. Now, if I had more time, I could talk about those particular teams because they were named after teams from Fleetwood and Chorley, okay, because it was actually a lady from the UK that came out to encourage these females in these particular games. I won't go there, it's a diversion. But let's remember, 1915 to 1921, the games, the teams, the clubs and the competitions were very short-lived, rarely lasting for more than a season, quickly fading from public memory. It was a fragmented, disjointed, discontinuous and sporadic affair with no infrastructure or any ongoing institutional support for women's football. These were one-off games, played for charity, pack up your gear, girls, that's it. Same in Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, etc. There were no competitions that went for more than 1 or 2 seasons, and in some seasons they might only play the one game. Unlike soccer, however, because as most of us know, and it's been referred to already, there was a ban in the UK put on females using football grounds, soccer grounds. In Australia, the British Association Football Interstate Conference in Melbourne in January 1922 passed this motion. Ladies football, following the decision of the English FC, perhaps FA, conference, unanimously decided not to recognise ladies football in any shape or form and to forbid the use of any association club grounds for such matches. So this is the soccer fraternity in Australia saying, yeah, well, we'll do what they're doing in the UK, and we don't want women playing soccer on our grounds. There was never any official ban against women playing Australian rules football in Australia, anywhere in Australia. There was some opposition, but there was no official ban. There was no statement like this made. So this brings us to the 1930s. We've looked at the beginnings in the Great War, we've looked a little bit at the 1920s. I'm just skimming over some of the detail in a way to get us to where we want to go. The 1930s, originally for me at least, was something of a black hole in terms of knowledge about the history of the women's game, especially in the days before electronic newspapers were readily available. I had next to no anecdotal evidence, none of those nice images that I could draw on for the 20s or the Great War, and it seemed perhaps that women's football might have died off in this particular decade, only to flower again after World War II, when I knew that games were certainly being played at that point. But Myra MacKenzie and her memorabilia helped to set me straight. You can imagine then that one of Myra's items that my student Peter later brought to me created great excitement. It was this photograph. With Myra, there she is with the big blue arrow there, sitting at the bottom left. She claimed to be the youngest player in the team, the second youngest player in the team. It also came with a caption, presumably handwritten by Myra, on the back of this photograph that was pasted to a cardboard board. Here's what the caption said on the back. What a find. I've got a date for the game, I've got the name of the Carlton team's coach, I've got details of the opposition Richmond, I've got a crowd estimate, and I've got a statement that there was a film taken of the game. Wow. That's from my student who was living next door to this woman who said, yeah, I played football for Carlton during the 1930s. I was a little bit sceptical. Peter brought in the photograph. On the back is this caption. I had struck gold. Remembering that until recently, not a single current elite Australian rules football team had made any reference to, in any of their official club histories, to any support for female football. And yet here, according to this caption, according to the photograph, is Carlton providing their captain, to coach a women's football team in this game against Richmond, who are another elite team. Look through the Richmond club history, they don't mention it. Look through the Carlton club history, they don't mention it. And yet it was a game that was supposed to have attracted 30,000 people. I can tell you that my heart was thumping as I almost immediately headed off to the library to start scrolling through the microfilm. This is before being able to go on the net and say, tell me the answer. So I was looking for evidence of this newly uncovered women's game. So, with the 3rd of July 1933 as a nominated date, I thought I would play it safe and start the scrolling from the start of the men's season, which was in April. Checking both daily and weekly newspapers. Scroll, April, nothing, that's okay. May, turn the wheel. Paper, nothing. That's okay, I thought. Maybe the coverage and the build-up starts to happen in June. So I kept scrolling. June, nothing. In the newspapers, on microfilm at the State Library of Victoria, I could find nothing in April, May or June related to this particular match. Surely the coverage is not crammed into the first week of July, I thought. The match is said to have taken place on the 3rd of July. No, it wasn't crammed into that week. There was not a single mention of the women's game between Richmond and Carlton in the press between April and July. Was women's football really this hidden? So much so that a match attracting 30,000 spectators failed to attract any press coverage? It was obviously time to set up a meeting and have a chat with Myra. So, a few months later, after discussions with my colleague Nikki Wedgwood, I had a colleague in Sydney, sociologist, also interested in some aspects of women's football, and we made the appropriate arrangements, devised some interview questions, set up a day and time to meet Myra at her home in suburban Melbourne. Oral history at that stage was not really my modus operandi. It wasn't my strength at all. So it was good to have sociologist Nikki along as the expert, riding shotgun as we were welcomed into Myra's life. What happened that day changed my thinking, for better and for worse, about the strengths and weaknesses of oral history and the difficulties of researching women's football. So, Nikki and I came with a set of research questions in mind relating to women's football. But we agreed that we wanted to try and establish more of a life history so that we would fully understand the social and historical context of Myra's experience, rather than having a narrow focus on the who, the what and the when of women's football, even though such factual information was important. So, very briefly, here's what we found out from interviewing Myra. Myra MacKenzie was born in New South Wales, near the Queensland border. So this is quite a distance from Victoria. She was born in 1917, the second eldest child in a family with 4 male and 4 female children. They moved to Melbourne when she was 12, where she first saw football played. She then later learned bookkeeping before working in her father's importing business as a delivery girl for shoe buckles, about the time that she played in this football match. She later married and had 3 children before her first husband died 10 years into the marriage. She later remarried. Myra's father loomed large in her upbringing, and he played rugby until he was 50, coached and played cricket, and encouraged his 8 children to be active in cycling, cricket, swimming, boxing, netball, and Myra had this photograph which she shared. It's Myra where the arrow's pointing there. She's a couple of years older here after the football game, but she was certainly keen on netball. She also had, Myra's father encouraged his children to be involved in hockey and athletics. None more so than Myra, who claimed that, quote, "My father took me to every sporting event there ever was." In fact, Myra and her family lived opposite the Carlton football ground and would watch the male Carlton footballers train twice a week. So there's a little bit of background on Myra. What about the women's match? So we, led her through her life history and got to talk about the women's football match. Myra claimed that her father saw an advertisement in the newspaper for girls and women to be in a football match as part of a carnival, a fundraising carnival, and he encouraged her to give it a go. She says that about 70 females turned up at training, and over several weeks the squad was trimmed down to those who took the field. Myra, who had just turned 16 before the match was played, said most of the team were older than her, some by 10 years or more, with just one other player, Violet, younger than her. None of the females on the team were married, according to Myra. She also claimed only one other player on her team was actually local, with the others coming from distant suburbs, which might explain the second framed studio shot that Myra had in her possession. Okay, and there's Myra there. She says that the photograph was taken several days after the match, but she revealed not all of the girls in this image actually played in the match. Something of a wake-up call for historians who might take images of sporting teams for granted. And she would pick out some of the players and say, no, she wasn't in the game. These were ring-ins, if you like, substitutes just to make up the numbers in this photograph of the team that was taken after the match was played. Myra says the players in her team were all presented with individual cups at presentation night at the local theatre, and it wasn't surprising that Myra had kept her trophy from 1933. My amateur photography doesn't do the object justice, but I include the text of the inscription so you can make out what was on the front of the cup. So here's the trophy. Every player got one, or every Carlton player got one at least. They won the game. It's hard to make out the inscription because of the flare of the camera. Here's what the inscription said. Presented by Carlton Football Club to Myra MacKenzie, Carlton Ladies versus Richmond Ladies, 3rd of July 1933. I'm going to come back to that trophy later, but just see if you can remember that transcription, that inscription on this physical object. Two other matters I want to mention from the interview, remembering that we had not really found, I'd not really found any press coverage of the map, although Myra, I think, did have a newspaper clipping, undated, unidentified. I hadn't found any press coverage of the match from our initial research, although it seemed clear that the undated team shot of the Carlton women on the field that Myra had pasted to the backing board seemed to come from a press article about the game. What about the opposition, Nikki asked. Who were the Richmond ladies you played against? Myra said that the team they played against was made up of girls and women from the Bryant and May factory, a business which made matches and was located in Richmond. In some ways this was not surprising because, as I've noted before, it is not unusual for the template to be followed. That is, a workplace-based team of female footballers, often involved in charity matches. So she said that the opposition came from the Brighton May factory, girls that worked there. The second matter is the movie tone newsreel mentioned in the caption on the back of Myra's photograph. A cine sound newsreel, as she referred to it in the interview. Where could that footage be? Did it exist? Nikki and I made inquiries to the National Sound and Film Archive in Canberra, but it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, looking for a film clip or a women's match. No, can't help you. So, we thanked Myra for the interview, presented her with some flowers and left her home fairly satisfied with the information we had gleaned, but still with some nagging doubts about aspects of the story. Here's a photograph I took of Myra on that day. It's a pity I couldn't catch her laughing or smiling, which was, the laughing and smiling was her demeanour for much of the interview. But in 2007, when we interviewed her, she was in pretty good condition for an 89-year-old, still going to watch her beloved Carlton play on a regular basis. It was not unreasonable to think that we would have a follow-up interview with her at some time in the future. Sadly, we lost contact with her after she moved house, and we never did a follow-up interview, despite the fact that she lived for almost another 10 years, as we later found out. What I want to discuss now, I guess, in academic terms, is the data. What happens when the data is tested and you find yourself confronted by things like incorrect dates, imprecise information, incorrect personnel? Have you had that experience? Let me explain. After the interview, some of the jigsaw started to fall into place. One important aspect was that I continued to do some newspaper research, and critical evidence was uncovered. Now, what was that inscription on Myra's trophy that I asked you to remember? 3rd of July 1933. That was the inscription on the trophy, yeah? Let's see if you're right there. The inscription on the trophy was that. The date on her caption was that, the 3rd of July 1933. That's why I initially stopped at the end of July, saying, well, there's no record. My suspicion is that Myra created her handwritten inscription much later, not realising that the date on the trophy, on the physical artefact, was somewhat incredibly incorrect. Because an extended newspaper search revealed that the game actually took place on Saturday, the 12th of August, 1933. In fact, the King's birthday, which she refers to, the King's birthday in 1933 was not celebrated on Monday the 3rd of July, it was celebrated on Monday the 5th of June. What is going on here? So, and I'm guessing here, perhaps this women's game was originally scheduled for the 3rd of July and then postponed, but they had the trophies made up in advance and decided to leave the incorrect date on the trophy. Now I think that's unlikely, but it's possible. Or maybe someone prior to the trophy night just provided the engraver with the incorrect date, and it was too late to fix the trophies when the error was discovered. If you've ever been to a trophy night, the trophies arrive in a box, you pull them out, oh, wrong date. Give it out anyway. Maybe. And I think that's probably more likely. Whatever the case, that incorrect date caused me to lose a lot of sleep and to look through a lot of microfilm, scratching my head about why the press did not seem to provide any coverage of the match. Well, I was looking in the wrong place on the wrong date. Now, if that was the downside of my research, then Myra's revelation that the opposition was made up of females from the Brighton May factory seems like a winner, because nowhere in the press coverage that I've looked at for the match on the 12th of August 1933 does it say who the Richmond team were representing. To me, Myra's suggestion possibly has the ring of truth because, as I've discovered on the book on the history of matchmaking in Australia, Brighton May were an offshoot of a British Quaker firm who believed in providing and encouraging a multitude of recreational and sporting activities for their employees during and after working hours, which was also the case at the Richmond factory. Let me explain with some images from the press. So, here's what the press coverage revealed. Extensive coverage of the game from the 12th of August. This is Myra, number 28. Here is the game in action. At the home of the Carlton Football Club. There's the opposition team, the Richmond team. So this was a full-page feature. I'm talking full page, that size page, in the newspaper following the game. Now, I just want to, after showing that, I want to show you where Myra thinks the Richmond girls came from. It's a little bit pixelated there. I've taken it off a library website. That's the Brighton May factory, which still stands in Melbourne. At least the shell of it does, but that's where they used to make matches. That's a netball court outside their factory. That's them, the employees, doing calisthenics, and that's an out-of-work tennis team representing the Brighton May factory. It's quite possible that they also supported the Richmond girls in their football match. Only Myra was able to identify for me that they were from the Brighton May factory. Now, the crowd numbers. Myra seemed to think that 30,000 attended, but press reports give a figure of 10,000. Perhaps explained by the fact that the match was part of a larger carnival day, might have depended on who was making that crowd estimate, start of the game, end of the game, middle of the day, 10,000 or 30,000. The press says 30,000 from what I've read. Myra, as you saw in a caption, said 30. And finally, perhaps the best success of all, we managed to crack the movie tone news quandary. Was the match filmed, as Myra suggested, and later viewed in cinemas? If so, making it the earliest known surviving footage of women playing football in Australia? Here is serendipity at work again, or maybe we should just call it the benefits that come from academics networking with each other. Tony Collins, the doyen of rugby historians, had made several conference trips to Australia and had gleaned quite a bit about Aussie rules from the papers he heard when visiting at various times between 2005 and 2008. He therefore knew of my interest in the history of women's Australian rules football from presentations I had made. On the 31st of March 2008, he began sending me a series of notes attached to emails that we were exchanging about other matters. Let's read from the top. Incidentally, you've probably already seen it. He says. But I've dug out some film of the 1933 Carlton versus Richmond match. I will bring it along with me. Interestingly enough, in the catalogue, the film is described as women's rugby. So I answer him and say, yeah, that'd be fantastic, Tony. Next email, in the next month. I've attached the file of the women's match. It's from the Pathé News UK website and filed under rugby. So I've emailed him back and say, yeah, fantastic, thanks. I've had a look, like the footage. Tony responds, glad you like the footage. That's all there is that I could see. The editors obviously couldn't tell the difference between the codes. So here is an academic on the other side of the world, looking through the Pathé film archive and comes across something that's described as women's rugby and recognises that it's actually Aussie rules. What am I up to on my notes? So Tony was a lifesaver. No wonder the footage could not be found when it was labelled women's rugby and filed in a UK film archive. Before I conclude then, let's see if the technology is our friend, so I can show you not only the oldest surviving film of women's Australian rules football, but Myra in action. She's wearing number 28. It lasts just 63 seconds. Okay, that's all the footage we have. It looks like it's part of a longer film, and surely they showed more than 63 seconds in the cinema when the girls watched it at their presentation night a couple of weeks later. Now the commentary is just as interesting, more interesting perhaps than the footage. So I do have the text of the commentary, but let's see if the technology works. So here's the heading. Soccer, cricket, perhaps, but rugby? Well, girls, really. Melbourne Amazons, before big and highly amused crowd, played first all-women's rugby match. How is that going to turn up on a search term if you're looking for women's Aussie rules? Well, it's not. Okay, now.
Coyness of Debutantes must be their first born. Now make way for the Carlton Ladies. 36, perfect 36, dainty ankles are hidden in their big fellas' boots. Now then, no roughness, girls. Oh, this isn't a bargain sale. Sylvia's got the ball, that's Sylvia among the feet. Go on, 21, they won't hurt you. All on the ball, the full-back the only one in position. Her boot lace is undone. Nicely saved, sir, man. Ah, that's Pickham. Oh, she's got a sway with her. That's it, get rid of it, get rid of it. Good mark, and what a kick. Fully 10 yards. Hey, what's wrong with the umpire? Oh, they're not taking any notice of him, he's only a man. Hello, what's happened here? Smelling salts, quick.
That's it. Now, there's a lot in there. And I'm not going to unpack it for you now, but Nick said press escape. There we go. The next slide just shows you some of the text, and we might just run our eye over it. I don't want to, as I say, unpack it all, but it's fairly typical of the period, fairly typical of the Sydney Sound newsreels. I have some from the 1940s of Australian rules football, and they're similar to this in tone and in language. So that's the earliest known film footage we have of women's Australian rules football. Nikki and I were able to do an interview with her about that. As I said, we didn't get the chance to do a follow-up interview. However, I am pleased to say that as a parting gesture to Myra, we did send her the film clip in July 2008 before she moved house. But to our regret, we, as I say, didn't do a follow-up interview. The result of all of this, which I'm very proud of, is that in 2016, on the eve of the very first season of the AFL's national competition for women. So women first played the game in 1915. It's taken until 2017 before they invested money in setting up a national competition for women's football. On the eve of that first season of the AFL's national competition for women, another colleague and I, Brunette Lankish, and I were able to integrate Myra's story into a book on the hidden history of women's Australian rules football. A fitting tribute, I think, to the valuable lessons learned from the experiences of uncovering Myra MacKenzie's hidden history and the sometimes serendipitous journey involved with researching the lives of other female football pioneers like her. Thank you. I'd be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Rob. Really fascinating topic. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions. We have got time for a couple now, and then we can move the questions on into the evening festivities. So, yes, Ray.
Yeah, what was striking was the photographs. Was you able to identify any of the players? Because you might find other resources there.
So in terms of identifying
The team players, because you identify all the members of the team.
Oh, only some. So the newspaper reports, for example, would give the best players. I'm mindful, and I read this again the other day, Jean Williams and I know other authors have said that often women would not reveal their real names for fear of the ridicule they might receive. So again, we have to be careful in just saying, oh, here's a list of the players, and that's who they actually were. Sometimes the names are changed or a little bit different. So yes, we do have some names of the other players. I think just gleaned from the newspaper report, I've got about a total of 8 of the 36 women that played. Okay, we weren't able to track any or find any others. Myra did not keep contact with them because they weren't her neighbours, they were from distant suburbs. Something I'd like to do, which I've hinted at, is to look at the Brighton May archives related to their factory, and just to see if any of those women's names are listed from the best player list.
First a comment then a question. Brighton May in England, the company was famous for its women's very active industrial strikes and things. There's a big strike in the late 19th century, Brighton May, because the life chances of women in the factory were actually quite short. They got what was called fuzzy jaw, and that fuzzy jaw limited the life expectancy and made them struggle a bit. So, but.
So the history of the Brighton May conglomerate is quite interesting, and
yeah, that's right. But my question is more to do with this hidden period, you call it. In a sense, it's ambiguous because it's, on the one hand, the texts all say this question of women's play is much debated. So it's not invisible in one sense, but it's very visible from a sort of male, single lens sort of point of view. But in England, quite often the football for right through the 20s and 30s carries on, but they can't play on FA sides. They find other places to play. And that means they can play, for example, in the north, they might play on rugby league sides, because rugby league's got no ban and is commercially viable to do that. And I'm wondering...
Yes, it's wrong to think that the ban was effective and that women didn't play. They did find ways to play in places.
That's what I'm asking, I think. Where are the locations that she talks about them actually playing?
So, yes, good point, because one of the reasons why women's football is so sporadic and disjointed and never long-lasting is that the males, commandeered the football facilities.
That's right.
Therefore, any opening for women was in a bye round, so there was no football played this weekend. That's when that Carlton game took place. So they had a carnival to raise money for Royal Melbourne Hospital on the day that the men weren't playing any matches at all. In World War I, the men were away at war and a lot of football stopped. They could get access to the grounds. Once the men came back from war, once the men come back after the bye round, the club says, well, sorry girls, that's it. We can't make available that facility for you. You can't even train there because our men are training there this week. So that shuts them out. You would think, in our modern sensibility, well, why didn't they just play on Sunday? Well, Sunday was a definite no-go area, and it's a double whammy because not only were they women playing sport, so that's questionable, but the church was saying, hey, we don't want you playing sport on the Sunday. So there are definite examples of that happening and restricting their access. So it wasn't a ban, but it was certainly a lack of available grounds for them to play on.
I think my point, Rob, is that in England, there are other sports organisations who are willing to let the ground because as you point out there are quite substantial crowds at some of these events, and it's commercially viable to run them. So I'm wondering why the same wasn't true in Australia. Northern Rugby League certainly ran women's football on occasion for a match and would get quite significant crowds sometimes.
But when would they run that? Out of the season, you mean, or during the season, or during the week?
When there's an opportunity to do it.
Yes. Well, no, to be honest, that's what in fact did happen. Any opportunity was taken, and I've learned now to not just do the microfilm search throughout the season, because often women play the games post-season because the games are available, or sometimes pre-season, or for any other opportunity they could get during the season. Some clubs are more amenable to it, and some, as you say, some other sports perhaps are more amenable to it. Knowing that the cricketers in Australia, the cricketers play on the same football oval, so once the summer season rolls around, that's for cricket only. Malcolm, were you going to?
It was that point that cricket is probably the only sports field that would accommodate Australian rules football because of the size of the paddock.
Yes. So to think that women would just be able to take over a small rectangular field and play the game is a fallacy, because they in a number of places said no, we want a full size oval. Full rules, etc.
I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask the final question, if that's okay. And my question, I'm sorry, you can follow up afterwards. and my question, I think, goes to, I think a lot of people sat in this room have come through a more digital-based process when it comes to writing their PhD. And yes, okay, we might access traditional archives, but the reliance on technology today in producing sports history it is so vast. And I suppose my question to you is, how do you think technology might have influenced the history of the game? Has it helped? Has it not? And where could it possibly go?
Oh, well, it's certainly influencing research into women's football now, because at the click of a mouse you can search what took me days and days to find. And of course there's some interesting work being done by a number of scholars where there's close reading and distant reading, where you get an impression to say, well, here's the dips and the references, crunch the numbers and we can see the trends, etc. Or we can take a closer reading and actually look at the individual articles and so on. Well, the reality is as time has gone by, and once the digital archive became available, then I was able to search that. Myra only ever played in one football match, and that was it. Okay? And that experience was true of many female footballers. And what a digital search revealed to me later, and I think I've got the date right, but there was a very small reference to the Carlton women playing another game in 1936, which I only found in digital search. So in combination, they can do the job more thoroughly. Knowing, and I know there are some digital skeptics out there, not everything is digitised. It's only a small proportion. Not everything is on microfilm. So to think that you've done a comprehensive search, as I thought I did with the microfilm, using wrong dates and so on, or thinking that I found nothing, therefore nothing happened, is something you have to be wary of. In the same way with the digital searching, of course, what term do you load in? If you were looking, as I say, doing a digital Google search for film of women playing football, you would not find that women's rugby match is filed under women's rugby. So I guess a note of caution or encouragement to be a little bit more circumspect about what methods are adopted and how thorough they are and what conclusions you might draw from that. I do encourage my students, as part of my teaching duties, just to get back to the teaching, I used to take those students from my class, every single one of them, on a field trip to the State Library where I showed them how to use the microfilm and said you need to do an essay a day based on looking at microfilm. Since then, I'll have to just stand up in the class and say, well, here's how you use the digital search. It's not quite the same thing, but it's the same notion of thinking carefully about your sources, about the data, testing the data, thinking about the data, and how you record the data. So I guess there's some general lessons.